The ground in the northern valleys of Israel is shaking. Long before you see the army, you feel the deep, rhythmic vibration in your chest, blowing a ram's horn to rally a massive militia. We expect God to match force with force. Steel with steel. He trusts the iron. He trusts the axles. He trusts the flat, hard earth beneath him. He operates under the assumption that his military technology makes him an untouchable god of the valley. He cannot fathom a reality where his greatest technological advantage could be turned into a weapon against him. Deborah, however, is playing a different game. She is not fighting a conventional war of attrition. She is not attempting to match Canaanite iron with Israelite iron. By drawing the heavy chariots into the lowest basin of the dry riverbed, she is weaponizing the geography itself. The tension reaches its breaking point. The 10,000 Israelites hold their ground at the edge of the valley, their sandals sinking into the dirt, their hands gripping their weapons, as the ground beneath them begins to violently shake. The 900 iron chariots thunder across the dry riverbed, closing the distance. The cracking of whips and the screaming of horses echo against the mountainside, and the heavy wheels raise a massive, choking cloud of dust into the sky, eclipsing the sun. Sisera takes the bait, fully believing he controls the flat ground. But he is about to learn that Yahweh controls much more than just the hills. The dust cloud rises to blot out the sun, and the ground trembles beneath the feet of the Israelite militia. But the biblical text completely ignores our expectations. Instead of zooming in on a military encampment, the 900 iron chariots are at full acceleration, charging across the flat, dry basin of the Wadi Kishon. But before the Canaanite front line can strike, the wind shifts. The sky above Mount Tabor abruptly bruises purple and black. The air pressure drops, and a massive, unseasonal storm breaks over the Jezreel Valley. If we only read the historical prose in Judges chapter 4, we receive a highly compressed summary of the battle. And the Lord routed Sisera, and all his chariots, and all his army. But to understand exactly what happens on the valley floor, we have to flip forward to the ancient poetry of Judges chapter 5. There, Deborah sings the hidden mechanism of the victory. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. This is not just a change in the weather. This is a targeted theological humiliation. In the Canaanite pantheon, Baal was the supreme rider of the clouds, the god of thunder, lightning, and rain. The Canaanites believed that if a storm appeared during a battle, Baal was fighting on their side. But Yahweh hijacks the Canaanite theology, invading Baal's supposed airspace to prove that the God of Israel holds absolute authority over the heavens and the earth. The narrative cuts away from the deafening noise of the iron in the valley and shifts to the quiet hill country of Ephraim. The heavy rains strike the mountainside and violently rush down into the basin. In a matter of minutes, the dry, hard-packed wadi transforms into a raging, overflowing river. A flash flood on a dirt plain creates an immediate, catastrophic physical reality: mud. Suddenly, the greatest technological advantage in the ancient world becomes a fatal liability. The heavy iron wheels, designed to crush bone on hard ground, slice deeply into the saturated earth and stick fast. The war horses panic, thrashing in the rising water, snapping their harnesses, and dragging the chariots deeper into the mire. The iron does not save them, it acts as an anchor, pulling them down. The environment itself has turned against the empire. Up to this point, the story has been a historical crisis of military supremacy. Now, the architecture of God's deliverance becomes visible. He does not provide Israel with 900 of their own iron chariots. He does not meet human industry with greater human industry. Instead, he unleashes the natural elements water and earth to collapse the proud, artificial strength of the oppressor. The Israelite infantry, unburdened by heavy armor, suddenly holds the absolute advantage. They swarm down the slopes, moving easily through the mud, and wipe out the paralyzed Canaanite army. The invincible war machine is utterly destroyed, swallowed by the valley it once terrorized. There is no army gathering here. There is no frantic forging of bronze swords. Instead, there is a single, solitary palm tree, but the tyrant himself survives. Seeing his chariots sinking into the mud, General Cicero realizes his prized weapon has become his tomb. He abandons his men, leaps from the chariot, and flees the battlefield on foot. The most terrifying man in the ancient Near East is reduced to a soaked, desperate fugitive, running for his life through the hill country. He runs toward the encampment of Heber the Kenite, a nomadic tribe that has maintained a peace treaty with the Canaanite king. Seeing a tent belonging to the wife of Heber, a woman named Jael, Sisera approaches. He assumes he is running toward sanctuary, far away from the violence of the battlefield. But the silence of the tent is a trap. General Sisera is running. His lungs burn. His armor is gone. And his boots are heavy with the mud of the Kishon. He has abandoned his men to die in the floodwaters. Desperate and hunted, he reaches the encampment of the Kenites, a nomadic tribe that maintains a peace treaty with the Canaanite king. Seeing the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, he moves toward it. He assumes he is running toward sanctuary. Jael steps out to meet him. Her voice is calm, offering the sacred hospitality of the ancient Near East. "Turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." Sisera crawls into the dim, quiet shelter of the tent, and sitting peacefully in the shade of its branches is a woman named Deborah. The contrast is intentionally shocking. He is exhausted, shivering, and stripped of his arrogance. "Please give me a little water to drink," he begs, "for I am thirsty." Jael does not give him water. She opens a skin of milk, likely rich, heavy curds, and gives him a drink, then covers him tightly with a rug. The heavy milk, the warmth of the blanket, and the sheer adrenaline crash of the day pull his broken body down into a deep, vulnerable sleep. But right before he closes his eyes, he issues one final order. He tells her to stand at the opening of the tent. If anyone comes looking for him, she is to lie and say, "No one is there." Even in his defeat, Sisera is acting like a dictator. He assumes this woman exists to serve him. He believes this domestic space is harmless, a neutral zone where the terrifying violence of the valley cannot reach him. He is completely wrong. Jael does not stand at the door. Instead, she reaches for two objects she knows intimately: a heavy mallet and a tent peg. The Hebrew word is yated. In ancient, nomadic culture, pitching the tent was exclusively women's work. Women drove the stakes, tied the cords, and secured the shelter against the wind. The yated was not a weapon of war. It was a tool of the home, a mundane, everyday instrument of domestic life. She creeps silently toward the sleeping general. The only sound is his heavy breathing against the dirt floor. Down in the plains, Sisera is dominating the nation with the peak of industrial warfare. Up in the hills, she positions the sharp wooden peg against his temple, raises the hammer, and strikes. With one massive, practiced blow, she drives the peg completely through his skull, pinning his head into the earth. The visual contrast is staggering. The man who commanded an empire of iron dies by a piece of wood. The general who dominated the vast highways is defeated in a cramped living room. Sisera built his life on the aggressive, industrial machinery of death, and he is undone by a woman holding a tool designed to sustain life. This is the exact fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy to Barak. The ultimate glory goes to a woman, but it is also a profound theological echo of the oldest promise in Scripture. The image of the serpent's head being crushed reaches all the way back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3. God takes a marginalized, foreign woman, wielding an ordinary, domestic tool, to crush the head of the oppressor. It is a shocking, brutal end. Modern readers often recoil at the sheer violence of the scene, struggling to categorize Jael's lethal deception. But to grasp the true theological weight of what just happened in the dirt, we cannot rely on historical prose alone. We must listen to how the prophet herself interprets the blood on the tent peg. And this brings us to one of the oldest surviving songs in human history. A woman is quietly holding court, settling civilian disputes, and listening to the voice of Yahweh. Most readers assume the blood has barely dried on the floor of the tent when the narrative camera shifts from historical prose to ancient poetry. Judges chapter 5 contains the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Hebrew literature. Through this song, we finally see the deep theological architecture of the victory. Deborah sings of the abandoned highways, the paralyzed villages, and the terrifying silence of an oppressed people. Then, she reveals the catalyst for the revolution. She does not say that a great warrior arose. She sings, "Village life in Israel ceased until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel." The Hebrew phrase is Em Be Yisrael. In English, the word mother often carries a soft, purely domestic connotation. We associate it with quiet nurturing. But in the ancient Near East, calling a leader a mother or a father was a declaration of profound authority. Yet, the nuance is critically different from the Canaanite model of kingship. An iron-willed Canaanite tyrant conquers to exploit. He takes land, takes resources, and takes lives to build his own monument. But a mother does not rise to exploit her children. A mother rises to protect them. She exercises authority not to dominate, but to create the conditions where life can flourish. Deborah's leadership was an anomaly, a desperate emergency backup plan. The familiar interpretation says that because the appointed male general, Deborah's leadership was not driven by ego or the desire for military glory. She arose because her children were trapped in the hills, and she refused to let them starve in the shadows any longer. To make this contrast inescapable, the poetry suddenly forces us to look through a different window. At the end of the song, Deborah shifts the scene away from the battlefield and into the Canaanite palace. She describes Sisera's mother standing at a window, peering through the lattice, anxiously waiting for the sound of her son's iron chariots. When Sisera's mother wonders why he is delayed, her royal attendants offer a chilling comfort. They assume he is simply taking his time dividing the plunder. The poetry records their exact words. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? A womb or two for every man? A spoil of dyed materials for Sisera. Look closely at the horrifying reality of the Canaanite system. Sisera's mother expects her son to return, having raped and enslaved the young women of Israel. She casually reduces human beings to wombs and prizes, a piece of dyed cloth over the dignity of human life. She represents the ultimate corruption of power, a mother who celebrates the destruction of other women's children to decorate her own palace, was too weak, cowardly, or passive to do his job. A woman had to reluctantly step in and do it for him. The contrast is devastating. Two mothers stand at the center of this war. One sits in a palace of iron, eagerly anticipating the exploitation of the vulnerable. The other sits under a palm tree in the dirt, risking her life to break the chains of the oppressed. This is not ultimately a story about military tactics. It is a collision of two entirely different kingdoms. It proves that the fierce, protective love of a mother in Israel is stronger than the most ruthless military machine on earth. God uses maternal imagery, not patriarchal dominance, to describe the deliverance of his people. That would already be significant. But the story does not end there. Once the pattern becomes visible, you realize that Deborah's victory is not just an isolated historical anomaly in the book of Judges. It is the blueprint for how God consistently overthrows the kingdoms of the world. The collapse of Sisera's iron empire under the weight of a storm and a tent peg is not an exception to how God works. It is the rule. Once you recognize the architecture of Judges 4 and 5, you begin to see it on almost every page of Scripture. We often treat her story as a historical accident, a footnote about male failure rather than a showcase of divine strategy. God consistently bypasses the world's definition of power to overthrow the world's empires. He refuses to adopt the weapons of the enemy to defeat the enemy. Look at the pattern. When Pharaoh's chariots trap the Israelites against the Red Sea, God does not send a rival cavalry. He uses an old man's wooden staff to split the water. When Goliath stands in the valley of Elah, covered in bronze and wielding a spear, with a massive iron head, God does not send a taller warrior in heavier armor. He sends a shepherd boy carrying a leather sling and a smooth river stone. God repeatedly takes the overlooked, the domestic, and the mundane, and weaponizes them against the arrogance of human industry. Centuries later, this exact pattern returns during the ultimate crisis. The people of Israel are once again occupied by a ruthless, technologically superior empire. Rome is quite literally a kingdom built on iron. And just like in the days of Deborah, God's invasion begins with a woman. Before Jesus is even born, a young, marginalized woman named Mary sings a song that sounds remarkably like the Song of Deborah. In Luke chapter 1, Mary sings the Magnificat. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. Mary understands the upside-down kingdom. Then comes the sound, the deafening grinding of iron rims striking stone, the cracking of whips, and the collective breathing of war horses. The problem is not that this interpretation is slightly inaccurate. The problem is that it completely misses the theological architecture of the story. She knows that God is about to dismantle the Roman strongman system, not by sending an earthly general to slaughter the legions, but through the quiet, hidden, maternal reality of a pregnant teenager. This pattern reaches its absolute climax at the cross. When the political and religious leaders conspire to destroy Jesus, they use the ultimate display of imperial dominance. They take iron nails and a wooden beam to humiliate and crush him. The cross is designed to be a billboard of Roman supremacy, a terrifying warning to anyone who challenges the system. But Jesus takes the very instrument of their dominance and turns it into the mechanism of their defeat. He does not call down an army of angels to slaughter his enemies. He submits to the wood and the iron, and through his sacrificial death and resurrection, Paul tells us in Colossians that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The cross is the ultimate tent peg through the head of the serpent. True power in God's economy does not look like brute force, aggression, or the accumulation of status. It looks like a tree, a song, cooperative humility, and sacrificial love. The kingdom of God does not win by out-hating or out-killing the kingdoms of this world. The narrative of Deborah is not a backup plan. It is a deliberate, brilliant subversion of Canaanite power structures. It wins by outlasting, outloving, and outdying them. But seeing this biblical pattern creates a profound tension for how we live today. We love to celebrate the victory of the cross, but we often refuse to adopt the methods of the cross in our own struggles, which leaves us with a deeply personal question about how we fight our own battles. When you are facing the iron chariots in your own life, where are you standing? The story of Deborah is not just a historical account of an ancient military victory. It is a mirror held up to our own understanding of power, survival, and faith. We live in a culture that operates exactly like the Canaanite Empire. We are constantly told that to survive in this world, we must acquire our own iron. We are conditioned to believe that we need aggression to command respect, unilateral control to feel safe, and visible status to overcome opposition. When a crisis threatens our families, our careers, or our peace of mind, our first instinct is usually to reach for the weapons of the world. We try to outmaneuver, outshout, or outproduce the things that frighten us. But the architecture of this story dismantles that illusion. It compresses the truth of God's kingdom into three radical realities. True authority thrives in cooperative humility. Ultimate deliverance often arrives. The deeper question is not whether Deborah was allowed to lead. The question is why God specifically chose a judge through mundane and overlooked tools. And divine power always flows through protective love, rather than exploitation. This changes how you face the opposition in your own life. What are the iron chariots currently dictating your movements? Perhaps it is a crushing financial situation, a culture of aggressive workplace politics, a toxic relationship, or a deep, paralyzing anxiety that keeps you confined to the hidden pathways of the hills. The temptation is to fight back using the enemy's tactics to become ruthless, to manipulate, to hoard resources, or to abandon your integrity for a quick victory. We think we need a massive, industrial solution, but God is not asking you to build a better chariot. He is asking you what ordinary thing you are already holding. You do not need to become like the thing that is oppressing you in order to defeat it. Your deliverance might not look like a dramatic, explosive confrontation. It might look like a tent peg, a mundane, daily faithfulness to your family, your community, or your quiet assignment. It might look like Barak's willingness to surrender his ego and share the credit. It might look like your refusal to answer bitterness with more bitterness, choosing instead to be a mother or a father in your own sphere, creating a safe space where the people around you can flourish. Step back and look at the Jezreel Valley in the days following the battle. The 900 iron chariots are still there, under a tree, and eventually another woman with a tent peg to break an empire built on iron. But they are no longer moving. They are heavy, useless cages, sinking deeper into the valley mud, rusting under the open sky. The terrifying technology of the age, built on pride and exploitation, was completely swallowed by a sudden storm. It was entirely temporary, but up in the hills of Ephraim, the palm tree remains standing. It was not forged in a fire. It was not built in a factory. It simply grew, quietly and faithfully, in the dirt where it was planted. It offered justice, wisdom, and shelter to anyone who came near. And long after the iron of the oppressor rusted away, the tree continued to provide shade for a liberated people. You do not need to wield the world's iron to experience the victory of God. The world trusts the chariot, but the victory belongs to the tree. This is not ultimately a story about who gets the glory on a battlefield. It is a story about how God uses the margins to dismantle the center. It is a revelation of what true power actually looks like in the economy of God. The victory will not come by mirroring the enemy's aggression, but by weaponizing the very things the enemy overlooks. But before we can see how the palm tree defeats the chariot, we have to look closer at the world Deborah inherited. To understand her strategy, we first have to understand the sheer paralysis of the Iron Age. Step away from the shade of the palm tree for a moment and look at the roads. A choking cloud of dust rises across the horizon, blocking out the sun. This is the military machine of Jabin, the Canaanite king. At this point in biblical history, Israel is caught in a brutal technological disadvantage. The ancient world is transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and the Canaanites hold the monopoly. Iron is harder, sharper, and far more durable than anything the Israelites possess. When mounted onto the wheels and axles of 900 chariots, it creates an impenetrable wall of moving force. We find a terrifying detail about this era hidden later in the text, inside the poetry of Judges chapter 5. The text says, "In the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned, and travelers kept to the byways." Consider what that actually means for a human being living in this world. The main roads of the ancient Near East were the lifeblood of society. They were wide, flat routes built through the valleys to allow for trade, communication, and the movement of goods. But flat roads are exactly where chariots operate best. To step onto the highway was to invite a slaughter, so the Israelites simply stopped using them. If a father needed to travel to another village, or a merchant needed to move grain, they had to creep through the dense forests and jagged rocks of the upper hill country. They carried their supplies on winding goat paths, moving quietly in the shadows, constantly looking over their shoulders, commanded by his ruthless general, Sisera. The text of Judges tells us he possesses 900 iron chariots. They lived as fugitives in their own promised land. This is how an empire of iron works. It does not just defeat a people in a single battle, it dictates their daily movements. It chokes the economy, isolates communities, and breeds a deep, generational paralysis. For 20 years, the nation has been locked in the hills, staring down at the Jezreel Valley, the great, to fertile plain below, knowing that stepping onto the flat ground means certain death. But Deborah sees the valley differently. She is not merely a comforting spiritual counselor offering religious platitudes to terrified travelers. She is a judge, holding the highest civil authority in the land. And as she sits under her palm tree in Ephraim, she is acting as a battlefield tactician. While the rest of the nation looks at the 900 iron chariots and sees an invincible war machine, Deborah looks at the heavy iron, studies the geography of the valley, and sees a fatal flaw. She realizes that the enemy's greatest strength is entirely dependent on its environment. An iron chariot is only powerful under specific conditions. Change the conditions, and the greatest weapon of the age becomes a heavy, useless trap. Deborah knows exactly how to break the Canaanite stronghold. She has received a word from Yahweh. In the ancient Near East, an iron chariot was not just a vehicle for transport. It was a weapon of mass terror. But she does not attempt to execute this military strategy alone. She understands that breaking the oppressive Canaanite system requires a completely different kind of leadership than the Canaanites themselves use. Her first move is to send a message, far to the northern territory of Naphtali, summoning a military commander named Barak. For centuries, modern readers have mocked this man. We have preached countless sermons using his name as a cautionary tale of male passivity and cowardice. We assume his response to Deborah was a failure of faith. But to understand Deborah's victory, we have to look closely at what actually happens when Barak arrives at the palm tree. Because history has profoundly misunderstood him, Barak arrives at the palm tree after a long, dangerous journey through the winding bypasses of the hill country. He stands before the judge of Israel, his sandals coated in the dust of the hidden mountain paths. The visual contrast between them is striking. A seasoned military commander from the northern tribes, receiving his orders from a woman seated quietly in the shade. Deborah does not offer a suggestion. She speaks with the direct, declarative authority of Yahweh. Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, fast, heavy, and unstoppable on flat ground? It was the ancient equivalent of an armored tank rolling into a peasant village. Go. Gather your men at Mount Tabor. Taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, Barak listens to the strategy. He knows the sheer terror of the iron chariots waiting in the valleys below, and he gives a response that has echoed through thousands of sermons. If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. For generations, we have read this response as a failure. We project our modern assumptions onto the text, concluding that Barak is a coward, a passive man unwilling to take the lead unless a woman holds his hand. We treat his words as a shameful dereliction of duty, assuming Deborah is disappointed by his hesitation. But that interpretation creates a massive biblical contradiction. If Barak is a coward who failed God's test, why does the New Testament elevate him? Centuries later, the writer of Hebrews compiles the great Hall of Faith in chapter 11, a sacred list of the heroes of Israelite history. Barak is named right alongside Gideon, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Furthermore, in the immediate context of Judges 4, Deborah does not rebuke him for a lack of faith. The problem is not Barak's courage. The problem is our definition of leadership. In the Canaanite world, power is concentrated in the hands of the autonomous strongman. For 20 years, these chariots have held the Israelites hostage. When we read the book of Judges, King Jabin and General Sisera operate by dominance, ego, and unilateral control. They do not share power, they enforce it with iron. Barak is modeling a kingdom that looks entirely different. He recognizes that Deborah carries the prophetic word of Yahweh. His demand is not rooted in fear of the enemy, but in a desperate reliance on the presence of God. He is saying, in effect, I will not lead an army of flesh and bone against an empire of iron, if the voice of the Lord does not go with us. He is rejecting the Canaanite strongman trope. He chooses cooperative, submitted leadership. Deborah immediately agrees. I will surely go with you, she says. But then she delivers a chilling caveat. Because he has tethered his command to her presence, the historical narrative will not flatter his ego. The road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. In the ancient Near East, military glory was a man's highest currency. A general's legacy depended on who he killed and what he conquered. Yet, Barak accepts the terms without a single word of protest. He willingly trades his personal glory for the presence of God. We have certain expectations about how God solves a military crisis of this magnitude. The situation demands a warrior. The two leaders leave the shade of the palm tree and begin to mobilize the troops. The cooperative leadership of God's kingdom is stepping forward to challenge the isolated dominance of the Canaanite empire. Barak gathers 10,000-foot soldiers. But as Deborah reveals the exact staging ground for the battle, the plan begins to look like madness. She is sending them to a location that defies every rule of ancient warfare. 10,000 Israelite men stand on the steep, wooded slopes of Mount Tabor. The mountain rises like a massive, inverted bowl out of the vast, flat expanse of the Jezreel Valley. For 2 decades, the Israelites have treated this plain as a graveyard. To step off the mountain and onto the flat ground is to invite the iron rims of Canaanite chariots to cut them to pieces. Yet, the voice of the prophet under the palm tree has ordered them to do exactly that. Deborah's military directive, recorded in Judges 4, is dangerously specific. She tells Barak to deploy his forces at Mount Tabor, declaring that Yahweh will draw Sisera, his chariots, and his troops out to meet them at the Wadi Kishon. To an ancient military commander, this strategy sounds like absolute suicide. We look for a man like Samson, capable of tearing a lion apart with his bare hands. Or Gideon. A wadi is a seasonal riverbed. For most of the year in the ancient Near East, the Wadi Kishon is completely dry, leaving a wide, hard-packed expanse of cracked earth winding through the plains of Jezreel. It is the perfect highway for an iron chariot. It offers no tree cover, no defensive elevation, and nowhere for an infantryman to hide. By marching 10,000-foot soldiers, armed mostly with crude bronze, and farming tools down to the edge of the Kishon, Deborah is intentionally placing her fragile, unarmored army in the exact environment where the Canaanites are most lethal. When Canaanite spies bring the report to King Jabin's general, Sisera does exactly what Deborah anticipates. He does not hesitate. Hearing that Barak's militia has descended toward the Kishon, Sisera mobilizes every single one of his 900 iron chariots, along with all his regular troops. You can imagine the arrogant confidence of the Canaanite commander. He has spent 20 years terrorizing these people, forcing them into the shadows of the hills. Now, they have foolishly walked out into the open. He sees a scattered militia of farmers and herdsmen willingly offering themselves for a slaughter on an open plain. He gives the order to advance, anticipating a swift, crushing victory. He assumes the Israelites have made a fatal amateur miscalculation, but Sisera has fundamentally misunderstood who is setting the trap. His greatest weakness is his absolute reliance on human industry.